Hello and welcome back. This is our final set of notes for this topic. We are going to tackle advanced cellular respiration. So in this set of notes, we are going to really focus on what the difference between anaerobic respiration is and aerobic. So remember that that is either without oxygen or with oxygen. But before we get started, let's just do a quick review of what we learned last time. So cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria of cells. It occurs in all organisms because all organisms need energy in the form of ATP. So all organisms need this. Plants, animals, everybody, bacteria, you name it, they need it. There are two types of cellular respiration that we are going to focus on, right? Anaerobic, no oxygen. Aerobic, yes oxygen, okay? So remember that this prefix "an" means without. So if you see anaerobic, it means without oxygen. So let's start with anaerobic because it's a much shorter process. So anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. And maybe you've heard of this, like fermented foods, like kimchi is a fermented food. And there's other types like yogurt is fermented, kombucha is fermented. So maybe you've heard this word before, but this is actually what this means. So let's explain a little further. So there is sort of one major step in the anaerobic process, and it's called glycolysis. That is how you say that word, glycolysis. And what this means is the glyco is means glucose, and lysis means to break down. So you are breaking down glucose, and that's exactly what's happening here, right? See, glucose gets broken down into two pyruvic acids. You don't need to know the pyruvic acid part, but you do need to know that glucose gets broken down. If you end up back in my class for IB biology, you will need to know all of this nitty-gritty stuff. But for right now, all I care that you know is that a glucose is broken down in glycolysis, and that this process does not require oxygen. This actually happens in the cytoplasm, so we're not even in the mitochondria, right? This is just happening in the cytoplasm of a cell, and 2 ATP molecules are produced. I don't know if you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, but 2 molecules of energy? That is not a lot. That is like a second of cell work, right? That's like barely anything. So glycolysis, while it's cool that it doesn't need oxygen and I can do it in the cytoplasm of a cell, I'm not getting a huge payout for this process. So my body is putting in all this effort to break down glucose, but I'm only getting 2 ATP out of it. Like, lame, okay. Give me something better, please. And I'm about to give you something better because we're about to talk about the aerobic process, okay? So before we get into that, let's talk about what happens after that. So there are 2 types of fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid. I know, the name makes sense, and thank goodness, because it's easier to remember that lactic acid makes lactic acid. So have you guys ever been like running in gym, I don't know, you're doing some sort of exercise and all of a sudden you have a massive cramp, okay? That is because your body has run out of oxygen, and so instead of stopping, right, you're not stopping, you're continuing to work out, your body switched from doing aerobic cellular respiration to anaerobic cellular respiration because it ran out of oxygen. So it starts doing lactic acid fermentation, and that cramp that you get is actually a buildup of lactic acid. Your muscles don't like lactic acid, and so they end up cramping up when you have a buildup of that. There's also alcoholic fermentation, and yeasts do this. So alcoholic fermentation produces alcohol, but also carbon dioxide. And if you've ever looked at a piece of bread and you see all these holes in there, that's actually yeast releasing CO2 after going through alcoholic fermentation, and all of these air pockets are actually where CO2 bubbles were. This is what causes bread to rise because the sticky dough gets like traps the CO2 as it's expanding. And so it leaves these air pockets, but also it causes the bread to rise because CO2 is a gas and it expands the dough as it's going through this fermentation. Now, the aerobic process is more what humans do most of the time. Of course, we can go through lactic acid fermentation, but most of the time we're breathing oxygen, so we have oxygen at our disposal. This is broken down into 3 parts, and the first part is the same as what it was for the anaerobic process. So step 1 is going through glycolysis. It's the exact same. It occurs in the cytoplasm. It does not actually require oxygen, and 1 molecule of glucose is broken down and 2 ATP are produced. That's step 1. So you'll notice that the beginning of all cellular respiration, anaerobic and aerobic, is the exact same. What changes is if there's oxygen, we then move into the mitochondria. When we move into the mitochondria, that's where the aerobic process differs from the anaerobic process. Step 2 of the aerobic process is called the Krebs cycle. This requires oxygen. It happens in the mitochondria, and you get 2 more ATP molecules. So again, this is just like sort of a picture. Glycolysis happens outside in the cytoplasm, and it either stops here and we go into fermentation, or it goes into the mitochondria with oxygen and we continue on making more ATP. So now in our aerobic respiration, we have made a total of 4 ATP molecules, right? 2 in glycolysis, 2 more in the Krebs cycle. And like, that's cool or whatever, but 4 ATP molecules is not really helping me that much. Like, I need more energy. Give me more energy. All right, we'll go to step 3. Step 3 also happens inside the mitochondria. It also requires oxygen, but in this case, we're getting 34 ATP molecules. There we go. Now we're actually getting somewhere. 34 molecules? I'll take that. That's a lot of ATP. I don't need you to know any of this fancy stuff, but I do need you to know that in step 3 of the aerobic process is where you make most of your ATP molecules. So let's do a quick recap. Anaerobic respiration, no oxygen required, produces only 2 ATP total, only has 1 step, but there are 2 types, lactic acid or alcoholic fermentation. Whereas aerobic respiration does require oxygen, it produces 36 to 38 ATP. That's a lot more, right? So it is very obvious that having oxygen in cellular respiration, right, doing aerobic respiration, produces more ATP. It is more beneficial to do aerobic respiration strictly from an energy gain standpoint. And aerobic respiration has 3 steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in class, but this is like a really good slide to write down to make sure that you have the bare bones comparison between these 2 types of respiration. Hey, great job. I'll see you in class.